If you're enjoying the Heath Geeks Book Club podcast, we'd appreciate if you hit the subscribe button, leave a like, rating, or review, whichever your preferred podcatcher platform allows.
This episode is sponsored by Well Balanced Nutrition and 360 Health.
Welcome to the Heath Geeks Book Club podcast. Listen in as Kristen Norton and Eleanor Russell review all those great health and wellness books you've been wanting to read or you have read and want to talk about. Here's Kristen and Eleanor.
Welcome to another episode of the Heath Geeks Book Club podcast. And we are energetically and enthusiastically enjoying our discussion of Bill Bryson's book called The Body, A Guide for Occupants. We hope you've been enjoying to our scattered discussion because it's going to continue. This book is just ripe for little tidbits, and we want to talk about the tidbits in our book club. And you know, when you go to book clubs, sometimes they get a little chaotic, don't they?
Yeah, it's just a back and forth.
Yeah, it's
discussion.
not like a lecture.
Yeah, no.
We're not going to a lecture. We're sitting here having coffee and talking about what caught your attention. So here's what caught my attention, because I know Kristen has an interest in nutrition, and so do I. I like everything, and I think she does too. But here's a little quote from the book. Towards the end of the book, he says something to me that I'd never heard. It is sometimes said, only partly in jest, that the worst health initiative in history was the invention of agriculture. Jared Diamond has called it a catastrophe from which we have never recovered. Isn't that radical? Mm-hmm. I mean, we always talk about how that was the revolutionary thing. We changed from hunter-gatherer to agriculture, and we could have all these societies and tribes and families.
It allowed us to stay in one place and
So he says,
build things.
He says, perversely, farming didn't bring improved diets, but almost everywhere poorer ones. Focusing on the narrower range of staple foods meant that people suffered at least some dietary deficiencies without necessarily being aware of it. Moreover, living in proximity to domesticated animals meant that their diseases became our diseases. Leprosy, plague, tuberculosis, typhus, diphtheria, measles, influenza, all vaulted from goats and pigs and cows and like straight into us right away. By one estimate, about 60% of all infectious diseases are zoonotic, that is, from animals. Farming led to the rise of commerce and literacy and the fruits of civilization, but also gave us millennia of rotten teeth, stunted growth, and diminished health.
That's crazy.
Think on that for a minute. Have a cup of coffee with me.
But it's true if we're eating all these grains and things that we wouldn't necessarily have as hunter-gatherers. It was a big diet shift, that's for sure.
Yeah, but this idea of deficiencies is interesting to me. Mm-hmm. And as we go on, there is a chart in here that somewhere that shows what we. Oh, yeah, it's on. Towards the end of the book, he talks about causes of death in 1900 and now. And when you look in 1900, the infections were the things that killed us, like pneumonia and flu, tuberculosis, diarrhea, infectious diarrhea. All right. And today, the top four are heart disease, cancer, respiratory disease, and stroke.
Which are all related to lifestyle.
Yeah, but she makes a point of. Interestingly, also, in the top 10 from 1900, it goes after heart disease, stroke, which is cardiovascular, kidney disease, which could also potentially be cardiovascular, then accidents, then cancer, then senility, and then diphtheria. But on today, what's killing us, suicide made the list. It wasn't even on the list in 1900. It's the 10th leading cause of death today in, I don't know if they say in the world or in the United States. Let me check that out. Oh, he didn't define that. He just said leading causes of death. Yeah, most striking between the two eras is that nearly half of the deaths in 1900 were from infectious disease. And, so all of a sudden we've kind of got some of these other things under control. We're beginning to get a little more frightened of infectious disease in the last 2 years, aren't we? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it looks like they may be coming back with a virulence that we held them in check with these antibiotics, but maybe there's more to talk about from Bill Bryson's perspective on that. But since I brought up agriculture and food, I thought I would like to talk about Ancel Keys because we talk about how Bryson ties the ideas into people and what people were doing and who was responsible for bringing an idea to the forefront. And we've talked about Ancel Keys before, haven't we?
We have.
Yeah, and so he gets a good little section in this book. Ancel was quite well educated, and let's say around 1944, that was the time period I think he was doing the majority of his work. He embarked on a study that would permanently seal his fame. It's called the 7 Countries Study, compared the dietary habits and health outcomes of 12,000 men, not women, in 7 nations, Italy, Greece, Netherlands, Yugoslavia, Finland, Japan, and the United States, and found a direct correlation between levels of dietary fat and heart disease, a conclusion that is hardly surprising now but was revolutionary then. And then by 1957, he'd gotten his wife involved, and she was writing cookbooks, and her cookbook was called Eat Well and Stay Well, and it promoted what we now know as the Mediterranean diet.
Yes.
1957, folks. This is 2023. And what's the recommendation today?
The Mediterranean diet.
Did we forget about it between 1957 and now, or why didn't it catch on?
I think it's always been on the top of the list as in terms of the best, but there's other trends, of course, that come and go and get popular.
But
And
could
then,
it be the
especially
bias?
in the low carb arena, they have a lot of hatred for Ancel Keys.
But do we think maybe politically and governmentally subsidized farming practices also could have influenced that?
Absolutely.
I mean, we have been reading some books that suggest that some of the dietary patterns in the United States have been influenced by pressures on governmental agencies to make recommendations and such.
Well, they have, right, the dairy department has a strong lobby community, and the beef industry.
Yeah, so it's a complicated story, isn't it?
It is.
But it is interesting that he came up with this. But there's a controversy about Ancel Keys' work, one of which is, I would say, it did not include women. And we have begun to discover that women are not just like men.
They used to think, they're just smaller versions of us.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, maybe not. Well, at least we should explore that and find out. And if so, then we could go forward.
Right.
But we didn't know. And then some of his critics said, well, if he looked at a country and he didn't like what he found in that country, he did not include the data in his report, in particular France.
Yeah.
Where they eat a lot of creamy,
French
fatty
paradox.
things, and they don't have heart attacks at the rate that everybody else did at that time.
Bread and dairy, right? Lots of bread and dairy.
And cream. Oh, lots of cream. Yeah, that's dairy, but
Oh, yes.
yeah, delicious.
Oh, yes.
Tim's like, take me there.
Yes.
But accompanied with the wine, and that's, in the last, since 2008-ish, we've been looking at what's in the wine that's somewhat protective, and it turns out to be these polyphenols. So that French paradox is that red wine accompanying these high-fat meals somehow gives you a benefit that doesn't affect your heart, if indeed the fat is responsible for the heart attacks.
And in addition to all the walking that they do.
Oh, yeah, exactly, the active lifestyle.
But then they smoke a lot. It's
Yes,
just,
they do.
It is a paradox. It's strange. But yeah, Keys is known for saying that saturated fats found in the milk and meat have adverse effects. So, like you were saying, our food guide pyramid includes beef and dairy, probably because of the money that those industries.
Well, I said Bill Bryson, our author of the book called The Body, spent a lot of time in Europe and in England in particular. And so he says a similar, more recent study in the British medical journal, The Lancet, in 2017, found that fat was not associated with cardiovascular disease, myocardial infarction, or cardiovascular disease mortality, and that dietary guidelines consequently need to be readdressed. Both conclusions have been heatedly disputed by some academics. So,
Yeah, and that's kind of where the low-carb industry is like, why didn't you look at sugar?
Yeah.
The sugar and its relation to
Ooh, so there's a book.
Heart disease.
Someone gave me a recommendation called something about glucose revolution or something.
Oh.
So we have a new book on our list. to consider.
Add it to the tally.
To consider, yeah. So that's a kind of what I wanted to say about Ancel. You have anything else you want to talk about?
No, I mean, he's just known for his foundation in nutrition. Oh, he also did the starvation studies, which was the first of its kind.
Yeah, that's awful.
Yeah.
He got conscientious objectors to participate.
To starve themselves, and then they once that study was over, they were able to refeed themselves and get back to health. But that was able to help him feed the soldiers.
The K-rations.
Yeah.
And that's the keys, Ancel keys, K-rations.
K-rations, yeah.
Yeah.
I never put that together.
Well, there's another one of little Bryson's tidbits. Hey, do you ever wonder where the word K-ration comes from? Ancel keys. Well, in this discussion of agriculture, since I said, I read you the quote from the book that he said it's maybe not the best thing that's happened to us. He also talks about how fruits and vegetables are nutritionally less good for us than they were in the fairly recent past. And Don Davis, a biochemist at the University of Texas, in 2011 compared the nutritive values of various foods in 1950 with those of our own era and found substantial drops in almost every type. Modern fruits, for instance, are almost 50% poorer in iron than they were in the early 1950s, about 12% down in calcium, and 15% in vitamin A. So modern agricultural practices, it turns out, focus on high yields and rapid growth at the expense of quality. And I think that's an interesting idea.
Yeah, so if you're interested in that, you would like Eating on the Wild Side, The Missing Link to Optimum Health by Jo Robinson. She goes through all of the different fruits and vegetables and their history and how we have modified them to our liking. And then
change their nutritional value.
Yeah. And some, so her goal is to highlight how to get the most from our fruits and vegetables. But some of the books, she highlights how they've changed and we've lost nutrient value. And part of that is the soil it's not present in the soil. So when you grow that and you don't rotate your crops.
Agricultural practices.
Yeah. So that's a fascinating read. And then I think there's a book called Pharmacology that goes into that. And it's, instead of with a PH, it's F. Total Health from the Ground Up by Daphne Miller. So that's another topic to dive into.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I'm so convinced that supplementation is something that's not out of the question for people. And so if anyone is interested in supplementing because of discovery that maybe the foods you're eating aren't bringing you the nutrients you need, go to my website, 360health4u.com. Fill out a little form there and we can start a conversation, or you can browse around and see what you think.
Right, and fruits and vegetables, so important. And at Well Balanced Nutrition, we spend all our time promoting them. But there is the fact that, just from picking them to the grocery store to the storage in your fridge, they're losing some of those nutrients.
Yeah, that transportation, they say, is a part of the loss because they pick before they pick them before they're ripened where they would have the more nutrient value.
Sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes. And then ship them, and they sometimes gas them to protect so they don't rot in transit and that kind of thing. It's tough. I mean, it is a food delivery system is a challenge.
It is. It's not perfect by any means.
No, and we don't grow. Most of us are not able to grow our own food anymore. And anyway, there's another little bit in here that I thought might be kind of interesting. In the United States, we're left in the bizarre and paradoxical situation that we are essentially the world's most overfed nation, but also one of its most nutritionally deficient ones. Yeah. Comparisons with the past are a bit difficult to make because in 1970, Congress canceled the only comprehensive federal nutrition survey ever attempted after the preliminary results proved embarrassing. A significant proportion of the population surveyed is malnourished or at high risk of developing nutritional problems, the survey reported just before it was axed. So, you have control of information going on as well.
It's too embarrassing to share.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I picked up on Bill Bryson's kind of disgust with the American lifestyle and just how we eat a lot, yet we're not getting a lot of nourishment, like nutrients, at the same time.
Yeah, and he gives us some great stats if you want to look at those about birth and death stats, maternal death and childbirth, our use of opioids, all sorts of, he goes and digs into some of the details about why is America at the bottom of all these lists when we're spending so much money we should be at the top of these lists.
Right.
Our investments are not paying off. And he makes a convincing argument, I think, about that. I want to kind of, where are we on it? Are we at the time of our episode, or can I keep talking? Oh, yeah. Okay. So, we said he has this historical perspective, and we were talking about some of the gruesome things that he shares and some of the interesting things he shares. And I've brought up the fact that women were left out of this Ancel Keys study.
Right.
And we know that women scientists have sometimes been ignored.
Yeah.
And I always kind of like to hit on that. But some men have been treated equally terribly. So I thought I could give you two examples of that. One is this woman named Nettie Stevens. Do you remember her?
Mm-hmm. She didn't quite get the credit she deserved.
No, she did not. And she's from a town that I thought was pretty interesting.
One we've talked about before on this podcast.
Yeah, have we?
Yeah, about the railroad guy who got...
Phineas Gage.
Yes.
Oh, good old Phineas got the tamping rod blown through his head. It was awful. Yeah, so it was a little town in Vermont, wasn't it? And there was another person that was in that same little town in Vermont, and I can't remember the name of it. But anyway.
Cavendish?
Yes, thank you. And she was...
an American biologist and geneticist.
And she discovered the Y chromosome. That's pretty cool. Why don't we know who she is?
Because she's a woman.
Yeah.
But we know now.
That
and we
sucks.
are.
Yeah, she's deserved more credit from that. And Rosalind... What's Rosalind's name that the DNA, she took the picture, Rosalind Franklin took the picture of DNA, and Watson and Crick looked over her shoulder and looked at it, kind of stole the picture, and then they get the Nobel Prize, and she dies and can't get it because she's dead. That can only be given to you while you're alive.
So unfair.
Yeah, well, but we know now.
We know now.
But it's a shame that some of these folks did not get the credit. Well, there's another guy, Albert Schatz, Schatz, who was a graduate student in Wakeman's lab, Professor Wakeman, and he does all this work to find streptomycin, one of our major antibiotics. You never heard of him, but if you were at the time, you would have heard of Wakeman because he just took credit for everything he did. He took the guy's name off the papers. When he received the awards and he got a Nobel Prize, he never credits the guy. Can you imagine being just, your excellence being voided?
Yeah.
Same way as sort of like Nettie Stevens and some of these other folks. It's like, why are we like that? Why are humans like that? Credit.
Who was that stole the credit? Is that...
Wakeman.
I feel like Grey's Anatomy ties into that story somehow. Or maybe that's a separate thing It
was another example, I think.
Because he worked with someone else.
The illustrator that did all the intricate designs his name wasn't even on the book.
Right.
Yeah. And the hours that goes in, and to understand what Gray was describing, you had to have the illustrations.
Right. And that's one of the most popular textbooks ever.
Ever, yeah. Anybody that's studied anatomy has a copy.
Yeah.
Even though they're nice ones that are more current, but that's the classic.
That's the classic.
Yeah. Another gory story was Fanny Burney. That's when you get into the surgery procedures and cancer.
Fanny Burney.
Yeah. And so I liked what Bryson did in this book, not only the investigators, but the actual people that the investigators used as their subjects also were credited, which, you got to have both. And these poor suffering people submit to these things that radicalize our thoughts. So when you had cancer before we had all these chemotherapy treatments, the cancers would just kind of open through the surface of your skin and ooze and drain and smell, and you couldn't go anywhere with anybody. I mean, you were really disfigured and a mess, and your quality of life was zip. And so when women got breast cancer, this guy said, well, why don't we just cut the breast off with no anesthetic?
Oh.
And with something that was a configured type of scissors that would circular, and so they have the patient's diary or the letter she wrote to her sister about the unbelievable torture she experienced to have that procedure done. And they cut out muscle and some bone, and she said the guy had to change hands in the middle of all of it. I think she must have passed out somewhere during the experience. However, she went on and lived 22 years after that. And so radical mastectomy was invented because it was successful in treating breast cancer.
And she was the first one for this?
Yeah.
She was a British author.
Oh. Well, she was a brave woman, that's all I can say. But on the other hand, if you have a shot at, I've seen other people in these awful situations say, look, if I'm going to die anyway, like the guy that got the heart transplant, he talks about that story. The reason they did it in South Africa, the first human heart transplant, was because you could take a heart out of somebody before they were dead. There were laws against that in other parts of the world.
Oh, my gosh.
That brain dead had already been determined as a criteria for a death in South Africa. So the surgeon could do that. And that patient said, I'm going to die anyway, so might as well submit to this. And he did, and he only lived 18 days, I think, after the transplant. But it did set the stage for future transplants. And look at what's happened with transplants now. I mean, there are options for people. So these brave patients and these unbelievably daring practitioners who have the stamina and ability to confront some of the things they do. I don't know. It's beyond me. Anyway, maybe we ought to wrap this episode up because there's more to talk about in here.
All right. Well, I am Kristen, one of the 3 registered dietitians at Well Balanced Nutrition. We invite you to check us out at wellbalancednutrition.com, where you can apply for a free clarity coaching call, and we might be the right fit for you to get nutrition and wellness coaching.
And as I said earlier in this episode, if you're interested in supplementing your diet, check out my website, 360health4u.com. And I'm Eleanor, and I'm saying over and out.
Adios.
Au revoir. And opinions stated in this podcast are solely those of the contributors and are not necessarily those of our distributors or hosting company. This podcast is copyrighted, and no part can be reproduced without the expressed written consent of Kristen and Eleanor.